This episode is brought to you by my patrons, my dear patrons. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. If you have been loving the show and would like to help out, the best way to do that is by signing up for Patreon. You can sign up for just $5 per month. That'll get you access to bonus episodes called follow-ups. I've published more than 24 of those so far. There's some really good episodes. I'll let you know who's coming up on the show so you can submit questions for guests. And this is new, you'll also get access to ad-free episodes. I'm going to start doing ads on the show here pretty soon. I've got some companies I've been talking with who make products that I love that I'm excited to share with you guys. So I'm going to start doing ads on the show, but for patrons, for people who are supporting the show financially, I want to make sure that you keep getting ad-free episodes. When you sign up, you'll get a link to a custom feed that you can plug into Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc. to bring up the Patreon version of the show that will have all of the follow-ups and ad-free episodes all in one spot. So if you want to check that out, head over to patreon.com/thenuggetclimbing. There's a link right there in your podcast app, and you can cancel anytime, no questions asked. And thank you to all of you who support the show. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Nugget Climbing Podcast. This is Stephen Dimmitt, and my guest today is Tyler Algeo. This was a really interesting and different episode. Tyler is a Canadian, but moved to Malawi with his wife a few years ago. Malawi is a country in Eastern Africa, and Tyler, along with some of his friends and companions, built a climbing gym in Malawi called Climb Malawi, with the mission of creating the equal opportunity for everyone in his community to discover climbing and participate in climbing, regardless of socioeconomic status. And that's the bulk of what we talked about in this conversation. I thought this conversation got especially interesting about 15 minutes in. It took us a little while to warm up, just hearing a little bit of Tyler's backstory. But to me, this conversation was a fascinating glimpse into another world that I've never been to. Tyler gave beautiful descriptions of Malawi, the climate, the location, the people, and how Climb Malawi came to be. Tyler and his wife also adopted 2 baby boys from Malawi while they were there, 2 young black sons. And it was fascinating to talk with him about raising his kids and how he's thinking about navigating things like mentorship and how to raise them with examples of other people that look like them and their inevitably complex identities that they're going to have as African immigrants with white parents back here in the States. Tyler and his wife have moved back to the United States at this time. So, yeah, a really interesting conversation. We also talked about the Climbing Initiative, which is a really cool nonprofit that Tyler works with now. He's the director of Impact, and we got into a lot more of who they are and what they do and how you guys can help out with the Climbing Initiative and Climb Malawi if you feel moved and inspired to do so. And on a somewhat related note, before we jump into the episode, the American Safe Climbing Association is coming up on their annual fundraiser, and these guys need our support because they support us as rock climbers. If you don't know what they do, these guys are a nonprofit that focus solely on replacing anchors and making sure that climbing stays safe. Over 25,000 bolts have been replaced with stainless steel hardware that they have supplied. They have volunteers active in almost every state, along with Mexico and Thailand. And in the last several years, they've installed over 5,500 sets of lower offs. So these guys are helping to keep us safe, but they do need our support. If you want to donate, I put a link right there in your podcast app and in the show notes. And you can learn more at safeclimbing.org. And I will put a link to that in the show notes as well. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode. And without further ado, please enjoy this glimpse into another world with Tyler Algeo.
Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we we do it like we do it.
Right on. Where are you talking to me from? Are you in Cincinnati?
Yeah, I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio. So the closest, like the home crag is the Red River Gorge, about 2 hours south in Kentucky. And my wife and I are actively working, even like a lot of change since I guess we last talked, actively working to move to Denver in the next year or two. So that's where she's got family based out there. And I grew up in Canada. I don't know if you got that part of my story, but I'm from Canada, and I grew up in the Denver of Canada, which is called Calgary, in Calgary, Alberta, near Banff.
Man, a place I would love to go visit. It looks breathtakingly beautiful. It looks so amazing up there.
It really is. And like photos can't really capture it because it's just like landscapes, you just got to be immersed in them. So yeah, I miss the mountains desperately, and we're planning to move out west. So, but for now, we're in Cincinnati, which is kind of where we were living right before we went to Malawi too.
Awesome. Well, I had a note here. I wanted to ask you about potentially moving to Denver, but let's circle back to that in a little bit. This is really fun because you and I talked some weeks ago, and usually I try to talk, this is a little bit of how the cake is baked for people listening. I don't even know if that's an expression. Maybe I just made that up. But how the podcast is made, I usually talk with people like you, a couple weeks ahead of time, give it some space, and then we have our conversation. And you and I had to reschedule. So now it's like 6 weeks have gone by or something. It's been quite a while since we talked, and it's really fun because I have all these notes and I only remember what about half of them mean. So I'm kind of rediscovering you in this conversation, which I think will be really fun and interesting. I have a note here, and I think I might have gotten this wrong the first time I asked you about it, but I have to ask about it again. Ireland, so you grew up in Canada, you live in the States now. One thing that, of course, we're going to talk about is Malawi and moving there and starting Climb Malawi and how all that came to be. How does Ireland fit in? And can you tell me about that? And can you tell me about your family's passports?
Yeah, sure. My wife and I met going to university in Vancouver, Canada, at UBC. And she graduated ahead of me and applied to the Peace Corps, but then was deferred and ended up applying to medical school and getting accepted into Ireland. There's a bridge program that makes it really easy for Canadians and Americans to apply to all the Irish medical schools. So she got accepted into Ireland right as I was graduating. We got married, and then I followed her over to Ireland about 6 months later once I found a job over there. So I actually started climbing in Ireland, but my friends had started to climb just before I moved in Vancouver.
What is the climbing scene like in Ireland? Were you just in a gym in the city?
Yeah, we were in Cork, which is the second biggest city in the Republic of Ireland after Dublin. Belfast is technically in Northern Ireland, so that's part of the UK. But there was a fairly big, strong climbing community up in Dublin that was much smaller down in Cork. Cork is like 300,000 people, and there was a guidebook for crags in the south. So I started at the university climbing gym, and then transitioned over to do more outdoor bouldering because initially that's all we did was do the outdoor bouldering. Yeah, it was pretty small, pretty manageable. That's how I made friends. I worked in an office that had like the boss and one other person I was hired with, and then they ended up quitting. So I wasn't really meeting new people in the same way that you do in university in a really easy way, the way my wife was. And a lot of her medical school class started to come to check out the climbing wall at the university recreational facility. And so that's where we started. And we didn't have any ropes or gear, and it's all pretty much trad climbing in Ireland. So that was less accessible to us. And so we just bouldered outside, and eventually we got bored of the roped wall or the bouldering wall, which wasn't very big and was only reset so often. We started to get on the ropes in the climbing gym, but I didn't get on a rope outside until I was back in Canada.
Okay, got it. What did you do for work while your wife was in medical school in Ireland?
So I graduated with an engineering degree in civil environmental engineering, which is more of the wastewater side of things, and went to work for a water technology market research consultancy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. And then what was it about Malawi that fascinated you and your wife? You both wanted to live there to help people. She became a doctor. I can't imagine that you could do the work that you just described in Malawi. Did you go straight from Ireland to Malawi? How did that come to be?
Yeah. So after graduating from medical school, my wife applied to residency in the United States. That's a process where you interview at a bunch of universities and rank them, and then they rank candidates, and ultimately you get matched to a program. So until you've done your residency, you're not, truly a doctor. And she got matched to Cincinnati. So that was immediately after Ireland. We traveled for, I don't know, like a month in Ethiopia, and then relocated to Cincinnati. And I went back to Vancouver to do my master's in engineering. And I used that as kind of a segue to get back to what I really wanted to do, which was looking at these low and middle income countries and different models for delivering water and sanitation in those different contexts.
Okay.
Through things like social enterprises. So my research in my master's was focused on like, what are the social enterprises that are active in the water and sanitation space in low and middle income countries, and kind of what's making some of them successful or some of them not successful, and why. We had actually, my wife and I met in our undergraduate degrees, kind of volunteering with Engineers Without Borders Canada, which was one of the strongest, most active organizations at the university level that was doing development work overseas. It was like, compared to, say, Doctors Without Borders, which you might think my wife would go into, like the student chapters weren't very active at that scale. Whereas with Engineers Without Borders, they were very active. When I was the president of the chapter, we raised $67,000, hosted a local conference, paid for 2 people to go and live and work for 4 months overseas, and supported 1 or 2 long-term staff who were working overseas, like
wow.
at our university level. So we've kind of always had this vision of finding a place to live and work in Africa somewhere long-term. It was, with all our travels to different parts of the continent, we've always enjoyed our time there and wanted to live there. I joke that my wife actually doesn't experience homesickness. She experiences like Africa sickness. Like, she's always like, I want to be over there traveling. And so now we're trying to find ways to like work that into our lifestyle in a different way. Mm. But that was a big motivator for why she became a doctor, was she wanted to work with the underserved communities and combine that with our just love of being in that part of the world. That's what kind of caused that ambition. And then there's not a lot of options for how to get involved in like a long-term way. And so we ended up finding a program where she could basically be full-time, like on faculty at a teaching hospital in the US, but be based in Malawi. And
okay,
so it wasn't like we were like targeting Malawi, but this is kind of like, that was the best option of the positions we found available. There's more out there, not all of which we felt were in alignment with our values and ethics about the role of Westerners in global health. But this one seemed like it was going to be really good. And that's what took us to Malawi. So I had 2 years in Vancouver of the 4-year residency. And then for the last 2 years, I was in Cincinnati with my wife. And then when she wrapped up her residency, we headed to Malawi. And we're there for about 2 years, adopted our 2 boys. And within, I think, a month or like a month and a half of getting a lot of all the paperwork done on that adoption and their passports and everything, COVID hit. And
oh, wow.
We ended up back here. Like, we got their passports in February and we flew back in March.
Because of COVID?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
We knew that due to just the vagaries of the global health kind of work landscape, that this wasn't going to be a 10+ year life in Malawi. It was looking like we were going to have to move back, unless, I was looking at different jobs, but it was difficult to find one that could truly support the whole family. There's this, interesting dynamics there. Like I was interviewing for a really great position in the water sanitation sector in a role that I thought I'd be really good. And they actually tried to recruit one of my colleagues who had been living in Malawi for 10 years, and they thought I'd be much better at the job. But they were offering $15,000 a year for the salary for the country director for the program, which I couldn't kind of maintain our family's life there for.
Yeah.
So it was clear that they were trying to hire a local person to take that on. And it's just kind of highlights that really strange dynamic that like two people who could have the exact same qualifications would have very different salary expectations. And that would be like, people who get hardship pay to work in some of these NGOs over in Malawi, or to work at the embassy or USAID, they're making like big consultant fees, like, $70,000, $100,000 plus a year, plus a lot of perks, housing covered, vehicle and everything. And, then somebody who's local with the exact same qualifications is making $15,000.
Wow.
And that's somehow normal and like acceptable, which it shouldn't be.
Right. Man, so much to get into there. Yeah, that's so fascinating. Hardship pay. I've never heard of that. That's so,
yeah. So some of those things are considered, hardship posts. Like if you're at USAID and or some of these NGOs, and maybe they've got, places that are cushier gigs, essentially, then you don't get that. But you get, it's considered a hardship post. So you get like additional, same like UK government, DFID, their kind of foreign development organization. So ship a container over with all your stuff. You have a house, you get a vehicle. It's like can be a really extremely comfortable lifestyle, which we have a lot of ethical questions about. So it's one of many can of worms about our experience.
Yeah. Well, I want to back up a step. I want to add a little bit more color for people, more of a description of Malawi, because, when I talked to you for the first time, and I'm slightly ashamed to admit this, but I had to look it up on a map. I was like, I know it's in Africa somewhere. I don't really know where. It turns out for people listening, Malawi is eastern, kind of central eastern Africa. It's not quite the closest, but it's one of the closest countries to the island of Madagascar. It's kind of right one country in from the coast of Africa, the east coast. And it's in the lush kind of central part of Africa. It looks very green. It looks like a rainforest climate, maybe. But I'd love to hear you describe first just the physical environment, what Malawi is like, what the landscape and climate are like, and then talking about these very different lifestyles that a Westerner can go and experience in an African country like this, like you're just describing. What was your lifestyle like? Were you living in a house? I'd love to just hear you fill in a lot of that color for us.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, like I say, in the southeastern part of the country. So the neighboring, or the continent, the neighboring countries are Mozambique, Zambia, and Tanzania. It can be pretty lush. It's unlike here where you got summer, spring, fall, winter. In Malawi you have essentially the dry season and the wet season, the rainy season. So in the rainy season, especially near the end of the rainy season, it is very lush. It's super green. But then like a couple months into the dry season and a couple months with no rain, and all the grasses turn brown. So that's kind of the cycles. And you get this period at the end of the dry season where it's still hot and dry, but the rains are coming and it gets really humid. So
awesome for climbing.
yeah, that's the only time of year when it's like not great for climbing, because the rains don't, when it rains, it's not like it rains all day long. So I've done plenty of climbing in the rainy season where you're driving through like heavy rain, And then you get to the boulder field and you're on, I'm pretty sure, granite boulders. It was hard to kind of understand the geology there. It's dried out really fast just due to the sun and the wind. So you're able to climb. There isn't a ton of cracks because it's equatorial Africa. So there's not the freeze thaw cycle that's really conducive to a lot of cracking.
Right.
So there are cracks. And from a climbing perspective, there's a guidebook from the early 1980s that somebody found in the chairperson of the Mountain Club of Malawi's attic that they kind of retyped up. And since then, a British climber who is living in the country for a while, he's gone around and tried to repeat a lot of those and update the photos and update the topos and provide additional information and published a guidebook on the climbing. But as far back as the 80s, there's been a lot of climbing on those cracks. From what I understand, very bold, terrifying climbing using kind of handmade bolts in spots where you didn't have the cracks.
Wow.
So not super accessible to beginners, which was what we were about in Malawi. So the topography is really varied in Malawi. You're at the southern end of the Rift Valley, the Great Rift Valley that goes through Eastern Africa. So we got one of the Great Lakes, which is Lake Malawi, which has a lot of unique species in it. And we were like a 3-4 hour drive from that. And so you're in the central region where we were, it's pretty flat for the most part. And then you would drive and have this, hit this like rise of mountains that was the edge of the Rift Valley. And then you would like just really windy roads, just gorgeous like vistas as you drive down into the Rift Valley, and then drive along that valley floor to go to the lake. In the north, there you're kind of, I think, a bit more mountainous, and I think more of the dramatic topography is caused by that like Rift Valley action. And then further south in the country, you get the big granite domes. The Mulanje Massif is not the highest peak, but one of the peaks, Chambe, its west face is twice as tall as Half Dome.
Wow.
So you basically climb up Half Dome, and then there's a big forested kind of ledge, and then you can climb another Half Dome.
Wow. So 4,000 feet total, something like that.
Yeah. So there's routes that go up that. We were based in Lilongwe, which is the capital in the central region. And then near Mulanje is Blantyre, which is the other big city. And then there's another regional center up in the north called Mazuzu. Blantyre and Lilongwe are both 1 million people, and there's 90 million people in Malawi. So there's a lot of people for a very small country. From what I understand, it had a lot of influx of people over the years because Malawi is a country it's usually ranked around the 5th poorest in the world. It does not have much of a basis for economy other than agriculture. So most of those 19 million people are subsistence farmers. They're just farming to feed their families for the most part. And in nearby Zambia and Zimbabwe, you have a lot more mining going on. And so early on, as during colonial times, when these countries were talking about independence, there was actually a movement to create a federation that included Zambia, which was formerly Northern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, which is formerly Southern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland, which is now Malawi, into like one country. But the leaders in Malawi kind of fought against that because they had seen how poorly people were treated in the colonies that had a lot of mining going on. So I think that's part of what to do with how Malawi ended up with this like very large population in a very small country, like even compared to Zambia, which is where I lived for 4 months when I was working with Engineers Without Borders. The population is way denser in Malawi.
And where did you live? Were you in a city or a village? Can you describe the infrastructure and what the actual physical day-to-day life looked like a little bit?
Yeah, we were in Lilongwe, which is the capital, 1 million people. And in a lot of ways, life was pretty normal. We had an international airport. There was restaurants, grocery stores, we had a car, and drive to the grocery store, get groceries, go home, watch TV, make dinner. So in a lot of ways, it is pretty normal. I think it's really easy for people when talking about other countries to either overly romanticize the exoticness of those other countries and cultures, or to catastrophize the hardship and poverty. But in a lot of ways, we kind of went about our lives in a pretty normal fashion. And then in other ways, things are all a bit different and a bit more challenging. So, for example, we used two different networks for internet, one for our phones and one for our computers, because periodically one of them wouldn't be working. Sometimes both wouldn't be working, but usually one of them would be working. The country relies exclusively on hydropower for the most part. So, I mentioned there's a dry season. At the end of the dry season, all the reservoirs are really low. And so you can have, you do have scheduled kind of rolling blackout periods where there's going to be no power. So a lot of the homes might have what they call inverters, which I feel like is the wrong term, but that's what they're called. But it's basically a large battery for your house that might run the lights in the fridge in one plug or something like that. Or some people have generators. Yeah, we had, city water, city plumbing, although a lot of the places in the city use septic tanks. And we're driving on the left side of the road. Life was, pretty normal, I think. It felt normal to us. It was our routine. My wife would go to work at the hospital each day. I was working remotely in Malawi for two previous clients, kind of consulting, and then also looking to consult in the local Malawi water and sanitation and hygiene, which we call WASH sector. And I was working at home. We had a housekeeper, so that was kind of a weird thing to get used to, having somebody around your house all the time.
Is that just a cultural norm there?
Yeah, it very much is. A lot of people have a housekeeper come periodically or every day, and sometimes people also have cooks come in and do kind of other like low skilled labor. Is essentially what it comes down to. When we moved in, the previous tenant highly recommended. Jobs are hard to get, so often like these people become kind of friends and family. So if you leave the country, which is I think a distinct characteristic of life in Malawi too, for people who are from other countries, is people are often there for a couple of years. So new people are always coming, and friends are always leaving. That's kind of on a constant basis, which is really interesting for your sense of community. And so you try to find new jobs for the staff that you really like. And so we were recommended a housekeeper, and we said, okay, like come a couple days a week. And then eventually her husband lost his job and went to South Africa to try to find work. And our housekeeper, Ruth, was trying to support her 4 kids and send them to school with, working a couple of days a week at our house, and asked us to help her find more work. And we ended up hiring her to work 5 days a week and gave her a raise. But we were still probably paying like $100 a month, which is considered like too much.
Wow.
And we would have gotten like grief from Malawian colleagues and friends if they had known, because it creates this sort of upside down economy where people are like, they'd rather get hired to work in a foreigner's house cleaning than like go to university, because
wow. Yeah.
You don't have the opportunities. Some of the, like, we were looking at how much does it pay to work in the commercial sector, say in a hotel or a restaurant, and they may be making $200 a month in that side of things. So the best jobs are really NGO jobs, working for foreign NGOs in Malawi, because it's so dependent on foreign aid work. So, you have this tension of you want to pay people a living wage and a good wage, and not like pay them these awful rates. But at the same time, like you're being told by the local Malawian population to also like to not pay as that much. So it's one of the many cans of worms of those like weird economics. The cost of living obviously is very different. So that's worth keeping in mind. But yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for adding that that context and that nuance there. It's so, yeah, we as Westerners, we do tend to think we can just roll in and give people money and that'll fix things, but we don't think about the consequences and the other problems that that causes.
Yeah, it's very easy to go in with good intention. I mean, the whole development sector or any of that work in low and middle income countries is replete with examples of good intentions gone awry, like donating clothing and sending all this donated secondhand clothing overseas. You think this is great. People are getting clothing for free or cheap, but it really sucks for the guy who's trying to sell clothing locally.
Right.
He's now being undercut
wow.
by these free clothes that are flooding the market. So yeah, it's obviously a very complicated, nuanced thing. There's other examples of just like things that people have no control over. Like you can grow a cash crop like paprika. I think in Zambia, that was for a while, people were encouraged to grow paprika to sell as a cash crop. But there's a lot of mining in Zambia of copper. And as the commodity market changed, the value of the Zambian currency changed. And so it basically, because of what was happening in copper, the Zambian currency changed, and that made it really not very competitive to sell the paprika anymore. So that cash crop, which you can't eat because it's a cash crop, is now like not competitive on the market anymore.
Wow.
Your community is left stranded. So when I first moved to and was living in Zambia, I had a really hard time with the resistance to change. Like people were living impoverished lives, but didn't seem really excited to try new things. And this was my like super naive 20-something self, not understanding that what they were doing has worked for years or generations to keep their families alive, and an experiment might cause people to not be able to feed their families. And people have seen for years that these NGO programs come and go, and then like they're just left with cleaning up the mess of if it worked or not. Like there's no guarantee that they're going to be there next year.
Sure.
As global priorities shift, you get mission creep where suddenly there's only funding available if you have an HIV/AIDS component into your in your program, and now it's hard to get funding for agricultural training, unless you do that too. And it's a big messy sector.
Yeah. Wow. Fascinating. Okay, I want to come back to climbing, and this will also tie into everything that we're talking about. If I'm doing my math right, you'd been climbing for 4 years or so before you went to Malawi. You had a couple of years back in Canada, and then in the States before moving there.
Yeah. I started in 2011 in Ireland. After I had actually planned to start, I would have started in Canada, but literally one day my friends were like, yeah, we're thinking about going climbing, and it sounded great. And then the next day they were speaking an entirely different language. They were suddenly talking about sending 510B on the overhanging with the roof and the prow, and doing dynos from crimps to jugs, and resting on slopers. And like, that all makes sense to you now, but for people who aren't climbers, that is all incomprehensible and really kind of isolating. And it kind of sets up this barrier where it's like, I felt suddenly uncomfortable to engage in that sport because I was like, I have no idea. Like, I have no idea what you guys are talking about. So I really feel for people who just walk into the gym on their own and like seeing other people who know what they're doing, but then also are speaking a totally different language that really does not invite people in.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I ended up starting in Ireland with other people who were trying it out for the first time. And so we got to kind of learn and grow together. Did my first outdoor leading in Squamish in Vancouver. And then when I was living there doing my master's, I took a trad climbing course. and started trad climbing. And then when I was visiting my wife in Cincinnati, I would go down to the Red River Gorge, Kentucky, and climb on some of the best sport climbing around. And then, so I was doing a bit of everything by the time I moved to Malawi. And I had a home climbing wall. We knew we wanted to adopt kids since I haven't worked, but it's a very long process. So knowing that I might need to take a baby monitor out into the backyard rather than go to the climbing gym, I had built a training wall in the backyard and planned to do that again when we moved to Malawi and continue climbing, because I knew there wasn't going to be much infrastructure. I thought that, I don't want to just climb on a 8-foot wide little climbing wall. So I had the foresight to ask for discounts as much as possible and get as many holds, as many T-nuts and bolts as I could to eventually equip how long was that going to be? 6 times 8, something like a 50-foot long bouldering wall.
Oh, wow.
To a commercial gym density. So I had, that's like maybe six boulders per 8 to 10 feet was what I was hoping to do. And I figured I would get to Malawi, find a place that was interested in having a climbing wall and donate that stuff and help them build and set it up.
Okay.
That was the initial plan when I moved. We had a shipping container, so I figured this is the chance to do it cheap, so we don't have to pay like tons of money to ship things over to Malawi.
Got it.
You can DHL thing. I had to DHL paperwork back and forth from Malawi, and it cost a pretty penny. So taking advantage of the shipping container was really important. And then built the training wall in the backyard, upgraded my moon board that was a static 40-degree moon board when I was living in the US to made it 12 feet wide, so I wasn't swinging into the supports on the sides. I made it adjustable. And then between all the moonboard holds, I put a bunch of other holds so that I had more options. And then people could come over and we could set the wall to a lower angle and do some easier climbing for beginners. And after a few months in Malawi, I was realizing that I wasn't really I didn't feel like I was really living in the country because I didn't have any Malawian friends or colleagues, because I was just doing what many people were doing now in the COVID days, working from home. And so unlike my wife, who had Malawian patients and coworkers and things, it was, just kind of me on my own. And then when we go out for a nice lunch, the price point of that restaurant would mean that most of the people there were not local Malawian people. So it was really clear that there was this socioeconomic segregation. And so with a few climbing friends, we started inviting their coworkers over to come climbing. And it became a really awesome atmosphere where, it didn't seem to matter what your salary was or how many degrees you had or any of that. It was just, all of us struggling to get up this silly 12-foot high wall and falling off of it and having a good time and shouting encouragement. And we saw some, neat power dynamic inversions where we'd have American doctors being taught how to climbing and listening attentively to a Malawian gardener with poor English because he's been climbing longer. And so he got to be the teacher, which is, kind of not how the power dynamics you usually experience. My friend who came to visit me, one of my climbing partners, he's referred to the powerful experience that happened a little bit later in life for him of, he's a white guy and his first time was very notable for him when he was the only one in the room who looked like him. And that happened to me probably a lot earlier in life, but as impactful of an experience as that can be, it's, you still, as a white person, you still have a lot of the power and the privilege in the room. So my wife and I have been on a lot of buses where it's like very clear in various African countries how people view the hierarchy, and they'll insist that I sit up in the front seat of the bus next to the driver. And then if like a village chief or somebody really important is also on the bus, like they're sitting on the armrest of the seat I'm in. And until I
Wow.
insist, like, no, we can share this seat. And then my wife, as a white woman, is usually put in kind of some of the front rows, but in the back of the bus, and not the very back, but like in the main part of the bus.
Yeah.
Often kind of a similar position that some of the men might be in, and then usually it's so that was an exciting experience to see that kind of shift in and kind of equalization happening, at least in that tiny bubble. And I thought that was like a really neat window to try to like see more of and experience more of. And as I was struggling to find a place that would build a climbing wall and host a climbing wall in a way that I felt would kind of maximize the benefits in terms of, say, like being open late, being able to charge very little, if anything, for accessing it, so lots of people could get on it. We decided that this could be a great thing on its own, and we founded a small NGO, local nonprofit called Climb Malawi that has a mission to create socioeconomically inclusive community through the sport of rock climbing, and give people access to the benefits of that community as well as the sport.
And who is we in that case? Is that you and your wife, or you and some of your climbing partners?
There's a combination of me and the kind of climbing community that we had built. So I spearheaded and drove everything primarily with one of my key Malawian partners at the time, named Jotex. And he and I developed everything kind of side by side. We were going out developing crags. I would have to rely entirely on him to navigate walking into a village and asking around until we could find the village chief, and then arranging a meeting with all the other chiefs so we could talk about how we would potentially come and visit their community and climb on the rocks that was there, as well as, kind of everything about how we would set up the organization. And now that I'm gone, we've got a few of the community leaders stepped up, to primarily 3 people, a Black Malawian man, an Indian descent Malawian, because there's a significant South Asian population in a lot of most African countries, and a American woman who works at the teaching hospital.
Okay.
And they kind of, between the 3 of them, are managing most of the operations day to day.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how many of the locals had rock climbed before, and had any of them, was this their first experience climbing on artificial climbs? Climbing in your backyard. Was that their first introduction to plastic climbing for a lot of these people?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think anyone had in the country seen, other than in movies. Like that's the line you get from people is like, oh, we've seen this in movies and I've been curious about it. I think within a short span of time, I had people reach out from different parts of the country, reach out to us saying like they were interested in it, or that they had some things. The international school had in Lilongwe, the main one they had a whole bunch of rock climbing holds that somebody had brought over, but they had the kind of T-nuts that you hammer into the back of a wood wall. And they actually wanted to install the climbing wall onto a brick, like masonry wall, which requires different equipment. And so those holds had just kind of sat there. Somebody else I know had built a little tiny wall for their kids in their house. And they had eventually, when they moved, they gave us all that stuff. And then down in Blantyre, actually, there is at the main international school down there, some British folks who were living in Blantyre, and the kids were going to that school. They arranged for something that was pretty much the same scale as what we were initially planning. It was about 40 to 50 feet wide bouldering wall. They had built that, but it was the way that operated which was not that dissimilar from what I'd experienced when I was traveling in Uganda for work, or these other places where there's a small wall at an international school. As it was only open one night a week. You had to pay or be a member to enter it, and at least in the case of Blantyre, the Malawians didn't feel comfortable entering that space. It's the international school, so it's where all the NGO aid workers' kids are going to school.
Okay.
And so it feels, I think, more like a a space for foreigners, essentially. So, but for the people in our community, yeah, it was definitely their first exposure. When we later, a few months into after founding the nonprofit, our landlord asked us to take down our wall in the backyard, possibly because it was getting too big. We're getting like 25 people on the weekends coming into the backyard trying to climb.
Oh my gosh!
Wow. I was bringing slack lines and stuff, trying to like keep people entertained, because you can only have 1 or 2 people on the wall.
Sure.
Most, when it's that small. And so we had a crisis and ended up doing a fundraising blitz, buying a piece of land, moving the wall there. And when people would then walk by and see it, and they would ask us about the hiking we were doing. Like, they didn't even have the language they thought of it as hiking. So it was definitely their first experience to it. Yeah. But people like climb, in the Mulanje Mountains in the south, there's, if you climb on that wall, you have to know that if you, on the low angle slabs at the start, you may encounter bolts without hangers, because, any Malawian child can barefoot climb up those slabs. So that hardware can end up going missing pretty commonly. And that's in some of the boulders. We had about an hour and a half from Lilongwe is a mountain called Nkoma Mountain. Just gorgeous. Not a very big mountain, but it would be, 300 meters. So it's some of the faces. So that's almost 1,000 feet. And there's lots of boulders around there. And there's one giant boulder, we call it the Bwana boulder, which means like boss. Bwana is boss. So on that boss boulder, we bolted one of my favorite routes. And it's like maybe 4 or 5 bolts. But to kind of prevent some of the theft that we knew we'd encounter, as well at this other crag that's about 45 minutes from the city in an old quarry, we'd essentially have to rappel down to top rope anchors to set up a top rope. And that way the anchors, those bolts were hard to access. But on the Bwana boulder, there was nothing up there to rappel from. So we had anchors up top to rappel to the top rope anchors. And those hangers have gotten stolen and need to get replaced. So there's some of the interesting dynamics that you deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. I want to ask you a little bit more about Climb Malawi. As Westerners, we have this idea, and people are listening from all over the world, so it's not everybody listening to this, but for most of us, we have a pretty wide range of things that come to mind when we think of a climbing gym. Obviously we have these commercial mega gyms with bright lights and bright colors, and they're clean and all these things these days, saunas and showers and whatever else. And then a lot of us have climbed in dirty basements, with cobwebs and rafters and exposed wires and things like that. And, climbers, we're familiar with doing whatever we have to do to climb. But I'm just curious, what was Climb Malawi when it was all said and done? I guess, what was the status of it when you left? You bought a piece of land. Was it outdoors? Was it a building? Was it, did it grow beyond just the moon board?
Yeah.
What did it look like?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things to know about life in Malawi is that most of the houses are behind a low brick wall, just because it's a very safe country, but petty theft is a thing because you have it's one of the poorest countries in the world. So I had shoes disappear or rope disappear, things like that. So that kind of petty theft is present. So to help manage that, usually you have a security guard and a low brick wall around
at your house
property. Yeah, at the house, and then eventually at the climb center. So we bought this piece of property. The first thing we did was had to build a wall around it so that we could have a guard to guard the climbing wall.
Wow.
Which wouldn't necessarily. Yeah, so it's essentially was this 12-foot wide, 12-foot tall bouldering wall, but it had the moonboard LED lights, so it had some things that were valuable and hard to replace, and sometimes things go missing that you don't understand how there's any possible value in it for people. But so,
Right.
we had to be protective. So yeah, it was initially just a bare patch of land next to the Dambo, the wetland. So there was we are kind of, it's probably like 100 foot wide stretch of land that's really green, and people grow vegetables in it because it's got a stream running through it that gets pretty big in the rainy season. But we're next to a house. And then by the time I had left, we had raised some more money, borrowed some money. So we had a shipping container that we had kind of cut windows into and turned into an office or storage space. We had built the foundations for a house because it was a residential area, and a lot of restaurants and NGOs operate offices out of basically houses that are just kind of converted to commercial space. But that we only got so far as the foundations of that future office. And then we built kind of the open air climbing structure. So it was essentially a foundation with steel columns that supported what you just call like an iron sheet. So it's like that wavy corrugated steel roofing that's kind of ubiquitous in that part of the world. So that was our roof structure. And then off of those steel columns, we built roughly 80 feet long of bouldering wall.
Cool.
So it was like, I think about 8 different panels of plywood. So we'd have like a 20-degree wall, 30-degree overhanging wall, 40-degree overhanging wall, a barrel feature in the corner that created sort of a cave, and a 15-degree wall, and then 2 slab walls that were set at like what we would call -5 degrees, plus the moon board. And so it was a pretty considerable amount of space, and that's all open air. So it's got a roof on it, but it's all open air because the weather's pretty great year round, other than that sort of really humid stretch. And kind of the dingy part of it is that we're still struggling to get connected to the city power grid. So, and solar is definitely an option. And so that's what we're running on right now. It's just a couple of floodlights on it, but it's power subsidized in such a way that it's so cheap that people are like, if you can get power, just get city power.
Okay.
We're still using what was planned to be as a temporary pit latrine that we've installed that periodically needs to get vacuum trucked, emptied, and eventually the house would have plumbing with a septic tank of its own for an office, but we're not there yet. So it's pretty much an open air facility right now, and then we've got climbing pads that we have to take in and out of the shipping container each day so that they stay safe and don't get stolen. And we have a staff who actually used to be one of the guards at the compound that we lived in. Our compound had 4 houses total, so like 2 townhouses, kind of in two and two, with 1 security guard and a gardener for the whole property. One of those guards started to climb with us in my backyard, and so he became our first staff member and has become a real leader. His name's Ernest. He is very soft-spoken initially, but it's really neat to see him kind of find his voice. And in the course of knowing him, he's had his first child, and his salary is now supporting him and his wife and his child, which is nice to be creating jobs in a difficult economy. And then we've got a security guard, but Ernest is the one who's usually there when people come to the climbing wall, and he helps them find shoes that'll fit. We have a communal kind of pool of climbing shoes that have been donated, and kind of make sure they have a good time and are doing things safe, because it's a pretty small community. During the busier times, there's always a volunteer host who essentially will do that same thing, help people find shoes that'll fit for them if they're coming in and they're new, and make introductions to the rest of the community so that they are immediately introduced to a community, and it's not just like you're coming in looking at a bunch of people who know what's going on and you're not sure what to do. And that's kind of how that introduction works for the gym. And then we also do outdoor trips. last year for Global Climbing Day, we were featured by the North Face, and they made a donation that allowed us to buy a minibus. So that allows us to get like up to 12 people who don't have access to vehicles out to the crag more regularly. And we're still using, we've got a pool of equipment that is kind of community pool. It includes harnesses, helmets, ropes, quick draws, so that we can take people, and the bouldering pads, of course, that I left all my gear and my pads, and people who come over with bouldering pads have left theirs. So those are the ones that end up getting taken to the crag because they're a lot easier to carry than the manufactured ones that we've just got mattresses covered. There's still a drill for doing more bolting, and some of the current people have a little experience with that, but nobody's got much experience with it. So that not a lot of new development has been happening lately. It's something we're working on.
Yeah, I'd love to hear kind of what your involvement looks like these days. You've been, you keep saying like we're working on this, or we didn't get to that yet, or things along those lines, and you're back in the States. So I'd love to hear what your continued involvement is, but also how is Climb Malawi funded? I know one of your goals was to make it inclusive and have a really low price point so that people, of all economic statuses could come climb and discover climbing. What is the model? How did that end up working out?
Yeah, so by the time I was in Malawi, I had already learned about Memphis Rox in Memphis, Tennessee, which hopefully all your listeners know about. But they're it's an inclusive climbing gym in one of the poorest zip codes in America, and they have a no one turned away for economic reasons kind of approach. And so taking inspiration from that, a bouldering gym, because you don't have to replace your ropes all the time, it can be very economical. If you have a community pool of shoes and chalk, like the infrastructure, like the holes don't, like you got to replace them eventually, but like you can stretch that pretty far. So we basically operate a donation-based model with a suggested donation. And then like Memphis Rox, try to encourage people who can't afford to become basically members through volunteering. And so over the course of a lot of the development and construction, and even just like landscaping and things like that, we've leveraged kind of our volunteer base of people who don't have the money to afford like making the donation to help us kind of take care of the place and build the place up, or act as if we go out on a trip to the crag, we will invariably have a lot of people from the neighboring villages come and like watch and want to try it out, and so we'll let them use the equipment as well. And so sometimes our volunteers end up doing a lot of belay duty, if you know what I mean, because people living in the village haven't been trained to do that. So it's a suggested donation only. That's negotiable. So if somebody's kind of middle income Malawian terms, they might offer a different rate. The suggested donation is kept pretty small. There's a climbing gym in Nairobi in Kenya that their day pass is something like equivalent of $20, just kind of like in North America, which just prices out a lot of people, unfortunately. So our monthly membership, come as much as you want, is set at about $20,000 or 20,000 kwacha, which is 15,000 kwacha, which is about $20 US. And then the day pass is around, like, it's a few dollars for day pass, but it could be less than $1 if, circumstances kind of permit. And then we got family rates and all the rest, but it's all suggested donations. And at the time I left, or just before COVID hit, it was, we had a suggested sponsorship level. I'm using air quotes there, for essentially $40 a month. And you got nothing extra. Instead of being a member, you were a sponsor, but like that was it. It's just, there was a lot of people who believed in what we were doing and had the money to afford $40 a month instead of $20 a month. So we actually had more people who were donating 40 than 20.
Oh, cool.
To help subsidize the the operations. And so kind of the model has always been, if we can only grow, staff and things like that at a rate that we can cover with those suggested donations, then we can try to use external fundraising efforts to build the infrastructure that's sort of like the one-time purchase. So, and then other gyms like RockWest in Cincinnati donated a bunch of ropes and shoes. We've had other people donate equipment from different parts of the world, bringing in ropes to kind of help keep and maintain that balance. But COVID obviously represented a huge challenge for us because pretty much every country said, hey, if you're overseas, come home. All the Americans left, all the Europeans left, all the Canadians left. And so within a span of a couple of weeks, all those people whose donation rate we were relying on evaporated.
Wow. Yeah.
And left us kind of limping. So the donation from the North Face has helped us see us through that. People have come back. Some people who are no longer in Malawi continue to support us. So that's how we've been able to grow. But yeah, it was right before COVID hit was when we finished that 80-foot long bouldering wall. And so before that, it was hard to we couldn't advertise because we only had this really 12-foot wall that got maxed out really fast.
Sure.
And then as soon as we could say, okay, now we can start bringing in groups, we can bring in schools, we can bring in NGOs that have, that want to do sort of team building stuff. We can really start bringing in a lot of groups. COVID hit and you couldn't have any gatherings. And so that has set us back. And of course, with in a country like Malawi, there's like COVID it came in late because there's not a lot of traffic to the country, but it just kind of swept through like wildfire because there's no ability to social distance. And access to vaccines was going to be slow and difficult. So there's been several waves. Kind of Africa did the best in the first wave, I think, of COVID, like as a continent, but then as successive variants have come through, it's been kind of unstoppable, and there's sort of a new norm that's been reached.
I think in our last conversation, you said that Malawi was in its fifth wave of COVID.
Yeah, I think I've heard fifth wave used for a variety of African countries. So
yeah.
Yep.
Man, yeah.
And it really, you don't know the numbers in any case because testing came super late and slow. There's a lot of people who pass away from something, and people don't know what. There's sort of you don't have a lot of diagnostic equipment at your disposal, and so people like even the American friend who's helping manage Climb Malawi now, Jamie, she was just sick with something that she thought maybe COVID, but then the symptoms didn't align. Maybe it's pneumonia. They didn't really know. They couldn't test. So they just gave her the antibiotics and she got better. And that's kind of like, that summarizes to me what healthcare is like in Malawi. You don't really know. You just treat it and you get better or you don't. And so
wow.
No one really knows how hard Malawi or these other countries were hit by COVID because you just don't know. Yeah.
And what is your ongoing involvement? Do you hope to get back there to continue working on Climb Malawi? Have you handed it off? Are you still engaged with it from afar? What does that look like these days?
I'm still engaged from afar. I'm still the chairperson of the board of directors. And,
okay.
As a kind of small volunteer organization, that's kind of all the roles are kind of shifting, and we all just kind of try to do what needs to be done. But we are looking to scale up. We've got a potential new source of funding interested in helping us build a larger center that would come with funding to hire an executive director, which I think is what the organization really needs. I could act as the executive director essentially when I was there and not get any money from it. But what the organization needs now, I think, is a Malawian, preferably a Malawian woman who loves climbing, to be the executive director to help us like scale and grow the operation. But because we've had this very grassroots, suggested donation, like, it's really cheap because we only got to pay for, one staff and a couple guards who are on rotation. Then when you try to hire somebody who has the leadership and professional skills to run an organization, you don't have any money for that role. So that's been a challenge, and kind of, I think, held us back from the potential growth that we could have had. COVID's still probably the biggest challenge, but the team that's currently running it now, they all have their day jobs and they're really busy people. And so I help coordinate what they're doing, and we try to have nearly weekly meetings, just check-ins about operational issues. They're keeping things running kind of on the ground, sorting out challenges on the ground. And then I've been working with Jamie and some others on kind of finding additional funding externally to help us grow, help be able to hire people in more official capacities to kind of grow the operations.
I want to ask you how this experience, how living in Malawi, how climbing in Malawi, how that's shaped your perspective of global climbing. You started in Ireland. You've climbed in Canada and here in the States. And it's just so interesting. Like, as a Westerner myself, I have this image in my head, and it's changing now because more videos are coming out of, featuring climbing in far off places. And there are these local communities of climbers there. But I still think of climbing as European and, Western North American, basically. Like, that seems like the dominant percentage, I guess, of the climbing population. It was really interesting to talk with you in our first conversation and hear, I guess, how wrong I was about that, maybe how wrong you were about that in your initial assessment, and how that's changed. I'd love to hear how your perspective of the climbing population globally has shifted.
Yeah, as I imagine a lot of people's experience, at this day and age, probably your first experience, or my first experience, was the gym, and then maybe the local crag, and then like the Chris Sharma videos, now the Adam Ondra videos, but I think I still prefer the Chris Sharma videos. I'd see IFSC World Cup circuits, and I'd hear about the pros and see some of the cool videos. But like, to me, that was what the sport of climbing was for a lot of years. And then, I started to hear about these other initiatives and other projects, and there just seems to be no end of really interesting communities. Memphis Rox was a big inspiration here locally. And I know, like, the Warriors Way group, formerly Rock Warriors Way, if people have read that book or Espresso Lessons, they work
Arno.
with, from Arno. They work with veterans who are suffering from PTSD to use climbing as a therapy. But yeah, there's, you'd see videos of people going to rocklands and having these epic rock climbing trips in South Africa, and not a thought would I have ever made to what the local rock climbing scene is like in the rocklands or nearby.
Right.
And yet, in Cape Town is an organization called Dream Higher that works with, I say generally at-risk youth, but specifically with refugees and orphans who get involved in climbing, get a new sense of community that doesn't result in them trying to find a sense of community in a gang. There's Young Ascenders in the Front Range here, as well as Escalando Fronteras in Mexico that the climbing initiative works with, all working with at-risk youth to give them new life skills and use climbing as therapeutics. You got Climb Like a Woman, Claw in India, who are building an inclusive community for women through bouldering events, which is really empowering in a healing community space because there's a lot of harassment that women face in India. Umarumi in Peru is kind of an environmental conservation group combined with building sustainable tourism through climbing, working with the local indigenous population to kind of look at their goals for the land and kind of do sustainable development hand in hand with communities. Climbing Life Kenya Paradox Sports. There's all these different communities all over the place that are doing amazing things. And I started to see it as well when I was based in the US and traveling for work a lot. I was working for a social enterprise that had developed a low-cost medical device, a surgical drill. And so I would end up going to Uganda, where the drill was developed, and going to the local climbing wall and hanging out with the local climbers. Or I'd be in San Salvador and go to the local crag and just meet up with local climbers there who, were putting up cool new routes there. And so, yeah, it's been really eye-opening for me over the past 4 to 6 years, I'd say, of kind of meeting people and getting exposed to that. And it was really important, I think, to have that experience going into Malawi, where I had the privilege and honor to introduce a lot of people to the sport, because people weren't exposed. And so they got exposed to climbing through me. And, a lot of development historically in Malawi of climbing routes has been like somebody flies in and they like bolt a new route up one of the big mountains. And that's cool. But it's and I think a lot of development of routes happens with this like sense of entitlement. Like, it's not your land. You just rock up with your drill, put up a route, thinking that you're giving a gift to the world. And there's nothing uglier than a sense of entitlement. But by kind of having this experience, it helped me kind of break down we can't help but view everything through our lens and our experiences of the world. But the more you're exposed to different experiences and ways of viewing the world, the better you're able to try to hold that in check. And I'm sure I made lots of mistakes and did some damage, but insofar as I could act with intention and humility, I was trying to introduce people to the sport in a way that wasn't just like a wholesale, here's what climbing is, So people would top rope the route and they would be like, I sent it. And it's every 2 moves, they sat on the rope and they rested, and but they had this huge sense of achievement. And so I had to put we've as climbing is a game, we've all agreed on, or to some extent agreed on a set of very arbitrary rules. I don't think I've sent a route until I've led it from the ground to the top. The draws can be hung. Some people it can't be. Some people you got to hang the draws while you go.
Right.
Where does a on-site become a flash? These are super arbitrary rules. And so as I was introducing people to sport, I was I wanted it to give them the space to make it their own thing. And so I'd be just so you know, a lot of climbers, in other countries, they would view it this way, but we make all these rules up ourselves. So whatever you want to do it. And so there's a lot of first ascents recorded in the routes that I helped develop that were the first ascensionists. They did it on top rope and they hangdog the whole way up it. But I felt it was important that in Malawi, Malawians should own the climbing. And so I wanted the first ascensionists to be Malawian names. I wanted the route names to be in Chichewa. I think I cared about that more than some Malawians who are just why does this matter? But I've seen it make a big difference in other places where you go and you feel like an outsider because things are all not in your language, or it's clearly not meant, it's not directed at you. You're not the core audience. And I wanted, insofar as I had an influence to help climbing develop in Malawi in a way that a Malawian would later come to the sport and recognize that this was a thing for them. And climbing in Malawi was about Malawians, and try to center them in that experience.
I love that. That's awesome. That's awesome. What was the name of the local language? Can you say that again?
Chichewa.
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 Okay.
Yeah, I have like a baby level.
Okay, I was going to ask that.
Dialect. Yeah, we were learning, and I had a little bit.
Can you say any of the route names? That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, well, it's one of the hardest routes is Osafoka, which means never give up. That's kind of like what we would shout at each other, like Osafoka. And
Cool.
one Joe Tex, he did the first descent of one, I think, the funnest routes, and it was called Zona, because he got down to the ground and he said, "Wow, that route is true." And Zona means like that's true, or like, so like somebody might say something, and if you really agree with the statement, you might be like Zona. So that's we named it that. I did a bouldering route that I had to clear a whole bed of thorns out of the way. So that's called Paminga, which is like on thorns. And one of my favorite routes on the Buana boulder is Zanse Momo, which was kind of like the best translation of a little bit of everything, because you kind of have to boulder. It's a big boulder, so it swoops underneath. So it's overhanging at the start with very difficult feet. And so it's kind of like a little tricky boulder problem, but then you get onto a slab, and the slab gets really thin and delicate and bouncy. And then you do an overhanging jug haul up to the tankers.
Oh, wow.
And so it felt like a little bit of everything. And Sansei Momo literally translates to like everything in there. Yeah, like Zikomo Kombiri is the thank you very much. There's a lot of, one of the challenges of learning the language is that they use NDI, in a lot of things. So like, if I ask how you are, you're going to respond with Indili Bueno. Indi is like I, Li is like the state of being, and Bueno is good. So, but it's like a hard thing to pronounce because we're not used to pronouncing NDI unless it's like, got a vowel in front of it. Like ANDI, you just be Andy, it'll be fine.
Right.
But you got to kind of like intonate Ndi without there being a vowel there was hard to pronounce. But yeah, we continue to try to, I still got my flashcards and looking to find a teacher here. Although remote teaching got a lot better, but we used to do a weekly class. But we want our kids to, our boys are adopted from Malawi, and we want them to grow up knowing Malawi.
Yeah.
They won't likely be fluent, but they do. There's some words that we use around the house that are just Chichewa. And
what are some common ones in your day to day?
Ngona is probably one of the ones we say the most, which is like lie down. So like when they're going to bed or for a nap, it's like Ngona. Buera means like come here. Madzi's water. If it rains, that's Mvula. That's another hard like double consonant. MV. U. And so it'd be like Mvula Mbiri, like lots of rain. Yeah, so Galu's dog, we could say Indipatsa, just give me. So kind of like that basic level conversation. And we want them to, like I said, know Malawi. So while we kind of continue to have ethical questions about the role of, say, Americans in global health as my wife's job, and then as well as some unanswered ethical questions about even like if we were just to live and work and have jobs in Malawi, like is that something that we feel comfortable with due to the like weird economic and power dynamics that's inherent in being from America and living in a impoverished country. One way we've hoped to kind of tackle that is just to spend like a month a year, maybe if we can find a work situation that will allow that, where we can go each year for a month and have our boys spend a month in Malawi and knowing the country that's their heritage and where they're from.
I want to ask you more about your boys. First off, what are their names?
Bodie and Moses.
Okay.
They are. When we adopted them, they had given names, just like first names. And,
are they brothers?
They're not biologically related.
Okay.
So they're.
I should have clarified biological brothers. Sorry about that.
Yep. No, it's common. So they're usually the question we get when people see them is, are they twins? And so sometimes we would say they are now, or not biologically, or just yes, because we're having conversations right now because they're getting to the language level where they're really understanding what we're saying, and they're going to be asked that question. And there's a lot of courses you take when you become an adopted parent about various elements. There's cans of worms within cans of worms here when it comes to adoption and international adoption and transracial adoption. But that your story of as an adoptee is your own, and you need to be able to, and as adopted parents is our own, and we have the right to that privacy. And so when like random strangers see that we have very clearly African children and my wife and I are white, they might ask about that. And there's a variety of ways you can handle that situation. You can give the full story, or you can shut it down, either politely with humor or not so politely. And
just owning that they're your boys. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. And it's none of their business. Like they're my family, and how that happened has nothing to do with you. Like,
got it. Yeah.
And like we'll have to teach our boys that like they don't owe anyone an explanation. They can just, they're both born 10 days apart. We knew we wanted to have 2 or 3 kids. So when we met both of them, when we loved both of them, we pursued adopting both of them. And in hindsight, we're really grateful because they will always have each other. They have a very complex identity. They both have a Malawian heritage. They're effectively African immigrants in America. They're living in America as African immigrants, as Black with white parents. There's a lot of complexity to their identities that they're going to have to grapple with through their life. And luckily, they will always have each other to help each other through that with a more similar lived experience. We as white parents, like we can't be everything to our kids. I think that's probably true whether you have adopted kids or biological kids, but it's extremely true when you have kids that are a different race than you, because they're going to have a lived experience that I will never fully comprehend and I can't prepare them for. And so we'll have to rely on community to do that, to have, Black friends, Black community leaders, Black mentors for them that will pursue, that will also coach us as parents to help navigate that complex identity. But yeah, in the meantime, they are delightful agents of chaos. They're about to turn 3. They're getting very talkative. They're starting to have a lot of opinions, struggling to emotionally regulate those big emotions, especially when you can't communicate very well. But they're the best. Yeah.
Amazing. Oh, it's so fun. I was going to ask you about exactly what you just shared a little bit about. We had a conversation some weeks ago. You had just climbed at Wizard's Gate in Estes Park, and you were just telling me, as much as you love the Red River Gorge, and that's been your local climbing area, being back in the mountains, sport climbing in this beautiful mountainous setting, and having more opportunity for other, types of climbing, trad and alpine and things like that. I just remember you telling me that the mountains give you this extra special joy, and it's, that really does seem to be important to you. You've learned that about yourself, that's important to you. And that's a big part of wanting to move to Denver. What are some of the other things that you've been thinking about? Of course, this last year, with George Floyd's death and race protests, and there's so much that all of us are learning and trying to educate ourselves about, things that we want to wrap our heads around that we will inevitably never fully understand. I'm speaking for myself as a white man in this country and in the world for that matter. But when you think about the move, when you think about finding a community where you can have, you can be a good parent, have mentorship for yourself as a parent for your Black sons, also provide them with, community examples, mentors of the same race. How are you thinking about all that I'll leave it really open. I have, I guess, more specific questions, but yeah, what are some of the things you're thinking about as far as that goes with this move to Denver?
Yeah, I think it's a constant thought. It's something we have to grapple with all the time, and it's certainly challenging. It'd be really easier to just kind of like go back to life as normal, I think. But for the fact that I have Black kids, and so that like is an everyday reminder of like little things like right now I don't ask for receipts when I go and buy like a small thing from a store, but I'm going to need to start modeling that behavior that like my kids will need to ask for receipts because they're going to get accused of shoplifting.
Man.
I know that's going to happen. And, even at this age, when I've been in like small towns and parks on a rainy day and had cop cars like lurk around us when there's no one else around. And I'm like, they're 3, but like, this is weird. So it's kind of always on our minds. We're moving from Cincinnati, hopefully to Denver. Cincinnati has over 40% Black population, and Denver has like 10% Black population. And we would be quite happy to live, my wife and I, in small town Colorado at this stage in our lives. But if you go outside of kind of more metropolitan areas, it's going to get really white really fast. And so we, have to grapple with the fact that we want our boys to grow up seeing other people that look like them. And so part of that is, our social networks. And I had originally a really white friend base in Cincinnati, just because I made friends through the climbing gym. And when I went to the climbing gym, there wasn't anybody of color at the time. That's changing now. And I've been involved in like local efforts here to also like encourage and grow diverse participation in the sport. Because I want my boys to be able to go to the climbing gym and feel like it's a place that they're welcome in. But in other ways, we're looking at, who like, the person who cuts my hair is white. But so we go to a Black barbershop for Moses, and we go to a Black lockist for Bodie, who's got locks, to get his retwisting. And we had to, it was very difficult to find a pediatrician who was not only within our insurance network, but also accepting new patients and is Black. And that's, that was hard in a city that's, over 40% Black, and we're moving to a place that's 10%. And so that's going to be really hard. Nationally, 5% of doctors are Black. And the national, I think it's the US is 13% Black. And so Denver has a population that's, there's a lot of people of color as well, but, a lot of those are going to be Latinx or, other ethnicities that aren't going to look like our boys. So, but even here, in Cincinnati, where you've got 40% Black population or more, it's very easy to go out to a restaurant or something and have it be almost all white, because it's still a very somehow segregated city. At least kind of seems that way. It's really noticeable when you go to a place that's really mixed. It shouldn't be noticeable, but it is. And so as we look to move to Denver, we're trying to choose our, where we would buy a house based on the diversity of the neighborhood, as well as like the quality of the school network. And then in some ways, we've just had to come to terms with the fact that as we've even experienced in Cincinnati, it's very easy to have a person of color or a Black person specifically be the only one in the room that looks like them. And so rather than trying to overly stress about that, like kind of the only way around that is, I think, moving to a place with a very large Black population, work on kind of connecting to community and, potential mentors in the Black community, and building relationships kind of more one-to-one and less worried about, because it's just too hard. You can't control it, what everyone on the street looks like.
How old were they when they left Malawi?
They were about 15 months, I'd
Okay.
say. So like they turned 1 in December, and then COVID hit in like March, and then we moved. So there's a year and a couple months.
Okay. And they've been in the States since then, and they're 3 now?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So, and we brought them home. We met Moses when he was 2 weeks old and just itty bitty because he was premature and also born. And Bodie when he was 1 month old, and kind of visited them throughout that period, but it took till they were 10 months old before we were able to bring them home full time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, man, thank you for sharing all that. It's fascinating to see a glimpse into your life, and it just feels like just a super interesting social experiment. It'll be like, what an experiment of nature versus nurture to see, your kids' personalities who develop and grow and them become their own humans, and how similar they might be as, twins who aren't twins. I just think it's great. It's just so interesting. And anyway.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun having two of the. It's when their naps go out of sync and you have just one awake. It's like a whole different world. How much calmer it is than having two of them awake at the same time. But wouldn't trade it for anything else. And it's been really fun having two of them because every week is different. Every month is very different throughout their lives so far, and there'd be things that the behavior kind of comes and goes in phases. And so there'd be things that were like, oh, maybe this is like a 15-month-year-old thing, but Moses is doing it and Bodhi's not. So we realized it's like actually like a personality difference thing, and not just like, oh, they're at that age where like this is a thing that they do. We're like, nope, this is just like, that's just a Bodhi thing. So
that is interesting.
It's fun to have that reference point. Yeah.
Okay, there's one big topic we haven't talked about yet. You did mention the climbing initiative, and I'd love to hear more about that. That is actually how you and I connected. Nikki, who works with the climbing initiative, reached out to me and told me about the climbing initiative and thought it'd be cool to do an episode featuring it. And rather than doing that directly and featuring this organization, I really thought it'd be, I always just like to get to know a human being. And I was really drawn to your story. I thought your story was different and interesting in this perspective of, this life lived in Africa and developing climbing there and integrating there is just, something I haven't had much exposure to. So it's been really fun to learn about that. But I'd love to hear more about what the climbing initiative is and how you first got involved with that.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting to be talking with you on knowing that there's all these other heroes and people I look up to who you've interviewed, and so it feels a little bit like my life feels really ordinary to me and really boring. So, why bother talking to me, and why are people listening? But I am excited to share about, the great things that are happening in Malawi and with the climbing initiative. And as I look up to Cody Camerlin, the head of Climb United at the American Alpine Club, and he has one of his sort of life philosophies that really resonated with me was to try to use your privilege with honor. And so since we're talking about it, I'd love to share about these other organizations. But yeah, I got involved with the climbing initiative back when I was still in Malawi. And the climbing initiative is a nonprofit based here in the US that's working to support the sustainable growth of the international climbing community. So more of a focus on like outside of, say, North America and Europe than inside. And started as through a Yale grant and a Yale Accelerator program, and started primarily looking at case studies and documenting the growth and development of the sport in these places like Macedonia, Slovenia, Palestine, the places you don't normally think about the climbing community, as we've kind of discussed. And then as the organization's grown, it's been around for a couple of years now, groups like Climb Malawi have reached out to the climbing initiative to, connect and share their story, as well as, ask for support on a variety of things. So I got first involved with the climbing initiative in kind of the capacity of their best practices project. So with all these different organizations like Climbing Life Kenya, Umarumi, Climb Malawi, Escalando Fronteras, CLAW, Climb Like a Woman, talking to the climbing initiative, became clear that some sort of body of knowledge, like we're all trying to solve kind of similar problems. And so the Best Practices Project, I think of it as kind of like the frequently asked questions of climbing community development project came about, where the climbing initiative was initially interviewing people all over the world to kind of get their lessons learned, but now it's transformed into a different approach where we're having just authors contribute, so that we don't have, not everything comes through our lens and through our voice, but is really reflective of the international community's voices. And so I was interviewed at Climb Malawi as part of that, and then later was brought on to kind of spearhead the Best Practices Project, and now also serve as the Director of Impact for the organization, looking to develop a roadway for us to contribute to the growth of these other climbing organizations that are reaching out for support.
Mm. And this isn't your full-time job, correct? This is a volunteer position, at least for the time being?
Yeah, for the time being, we're an early stage organization. Like I said, a couple years old. We've had a lot of assistance with the help of like the Yale Accelerator program, and have been welcomed and encouraged by the American Alpine Club and the Access Fund. The Access Fund gets these calls, when people are developing, say in, Guatemala, to pick a random place, and suddenly access gets shut down, and then there's no, as people, if you're familiar with the shutdowns of some of the world-class and really famous climbing areas in Australia, other countries don't have an access fund who's fighting for access. And so they end up calling the Access Fund, and they're squarely focused on, they got a staying true to their vision of fighting for access in America. And all they could do is offer some advice to fix a problem that's already gotten out of hand. And they're excited about what we're doing, because we're hopefully working with communities at an early stage, so that sustainable development can happen from day one, and end up with learn from the mistakes that have happened in the history of American climbing and European climbing, so that you don't end up with these major closures and access issues. So right now we're working on a revenue model, and pretty much all the staff we have a couple paid positions, but they're not paid very well. And we're all have our other day jobs essentially, and working to make it hopefully a fully funded and salaried organization, because it's very clear to us from the, every other week we're getting contacted from somebody in some part of the world who are like, we need help, and we could be doing a lot of good. And I think that, money, these organizations in themselves that I've, referenced, like they would greatly benefit from additional funding. But a lot of them are trying to solve similar challenges. And so we're trying to create a common body of knowledge and a kind of a codified set of resources to help those organizations. And so in theory, $1 invested in the climbing initiative would have a much broader impact, because it would help us develop our accelerator program that would then help each of those organizations, kind of like the way Yale, the accelerator, helped the climbing initiative grow and hit the ground running. We could be doing that for these other organizations. And it might be hard to kind of wrap your head around those challenges, because, if like you and me in our past selves would have just thought about the climbing gym and the crag, we don't realize all the systems that are in place to actually support that. So some of the things that we've done is really work with these organizations who have maybe a vision, an idea that's a kernel. Climb Malawi was build a socioeconomically inclusive climbing gym. Maybe Climb Like a Woman was trying to just get more women involved in the sport. In India, it's really easy to have a exciting vision and get people behind it, but then actually like building an organization that does that effectively is a whole other thing. So one of the things we often work with organizations on is refining their mission, vision, and logic model, or like impact model, essentially, where the theory of change, where it's like, how are you actually, like, what's the change you want to do? And what are the actual programs that are going to need to be in place to do that? We also would work with them on developing kind of impact measurement programs. So like Escalando Fronteras is working with at-risk youth, and using kind of based on the research of adolescent psychology, we've been able to develop impact measurement tools like surveys that kind of assess the youth's change in their perception and knowledge of certain topics, so that they can actually see if they think they're witnessing and they believe they're having this transformative impact on lives, because they have a relationship there and they can see that.
Right.
But you want to quantify that in some way to make sure you're seeing things as they actually are. Maybe there's more you could be doing. You can refine the programs. It also can enable organizations to publish and draw more attention to that kind of activity, that adventure-based therapeutics.
I was just thinking that if you measure it, that's gotta do a lot of good for getting fundraising dollars and getting other people on board with it, things like that.
Yeah, and for example, Uma Rumi in Peru, doing environmental conservation and sustainable tourism development, they were trying to get funding, but at the time didn't have a website or social media presence, and so they weren't getting anyone's attention to get money in the door. So the thing we worked on with them was developing a communication strategy so that they could get funding. Other organizations, we work more on a fundraising strategy, but there's a lot of different components to running a community organization and trying to introduce people to the sport. Thinking of like Climb Malawi, we still don't have an exactly solved system for waivers with a very different liability situation than climbing, say in America. A detailed membership system and managing volunteers. We get a lot of gear donation, but if everyone in the community is really new to climbing, who can you rely on to inspect that equipment and make sure that the rope's still safe after it's been donated? So, in a similar way to how a guiding service might have a regular inspection program and an inventory management system, there's a lot of systems, policies, procedures that go into managing that stuff. What Climb Malawi is doing well right now, I think, is we got really strong relationships with the villages, with the community leaders, the chiefs, and strong Malawian participation. Some of these systems and policies, they, are not where they could be. And these are things that don't need to be reinvented, they're things that can be kind of systematized in a way that's really easy to package and share. So our best practices project is really kind of these key lessons of okay, if you're going to do sustainable trail management or try to do conservation around cliffside vegetation or raptors, or you're trying to build an inclusive climbing community, what are kind of the key things you want to be thinking about? And so if a community reaches out to us, we've got that, and it's going to be free to everyone. We're going to be releasing sort of sample chapters in November that possibly before this podcast comes out, that will cover off some of those topics, but we've received funding to kind of transform this into a digital platform that'll be a much more dynamic living resource that we could also link to then how to do these things, how to do an economic impact analysis that can help you, get further support from the local government, because you can prove with numbers that climbing is bringing in tourism. But then beyond that, we also partner with these organizations and are working to facilitate gear donations, as well as the training around inspection and maintenance of that equipment. A climbing leadership fund, for example, we're helping bring one of the leaders of Climbing Life Kenya over to the US to do single pitch instructor course, because there's no when you don't have a mountain guide association, you don't have any formal accreditation to be like, hey, this is a mountain guide. So that's another challenge, another piece of the puzzle that like we have solved in North America, and could be better solved over there. So it's been amazing to kind of get to know a lot of these different organizations and see the amazing work they're doing, both in terms of transforming the sport of climbing, like I think locally and like internationally, as well as kind of the various ways communities are using climbing to do things like environmental conservation or working with at-risk youth, or building inclusive community. But they're down kind of in the weeds, in the day-to-day. Most people do this as kind of a volunteer thing, and they don't have the space or time to step back and think about like, what's the right organizational model for me? Or like, how do we develop a revenue model? How do we manage to inspect our gear? These kind of like high level strategic questions are really tricky and difficult to solve on your own. And that's where the Climbing Initiative is hoping to act as a partner, and a resource and help create a path for these organizations to not necessarily not do it our way, but access resources that'll enable them to really bring their vision to reality, and then also hopefully connect with other organizations. So we connected Dream Hire in South Africa and the Recreation Project in Uganda, which originally worked with former child soldiers, and the Young Ascenders in the Front Range in Colorado, all working with youth around the subject of like life skills and therapeutics. And at the time, they hadn't met each other, and they're all trying to figure out, like, the Recreation Project has a kind of more a program, a curriculum they've developed over years, and the Young Ascenders is kind of in an earlier stage working to develop those resources, and together they can actually do that without us having to like even be involved. So the Climbing Initiative, hoping to be a connector, also work with these communities to find out what are the problems they need to solve and help create those resources that they can then access. And then also making sure those stories get shared, because like me, I think most people hadn't heard of any of these organizations or people or sometimes places. And that's kind of, it's almost like being erased, because they don't make the climbing media. But there's a history of climbing for Palestine. There's a history of climbing in Jordan, there's a history of climbing in Uganda, and those histories matter and need to be told.
Well, thank you for that. That was an excellent explanation. I've been reading about and learning about the Climbing Initiative for some weeks now since I first talked to Nikki. And I think I have my head around it a lot better after hearing you describe all that than I had to this point. And it sounds like, obviously you're connecting these organizations so they can learn from one another, but you're just existing as this resource. So you're basically systematizing all of the things that happen behind the scenes, that need to happen behind the scenes for so many different organizations, so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel, and you're just helping streamline those processes.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a key part of what we're doing. Veronica Baker, our executive director and one of our founders, would also like point out that sometimes there's a misalignment in the industry where, somebody wants to have, sustainable like ecotourism, and climbers want to travel to, some place and have, say, Slovenia, go climbing in Slovenia and have like a really great experience that's, connecting with the community and things like that. But, currently there's no significant, it's not like in Kalymnos, apparently you can walk down the street and you'll get like advertised for climbing hostels, climbing massages. Like there's an infrastructure there that's, tourism dollars geared towards that climbing community. Same thing here in the Red River Gorge. We've got restaurants that are staffed and serve a lot of climbing visitors, gear shop campgrounds like focused on climbers. But in, I believe, Slovenia is a case where they've, since the 90s, they pointed out there's no one's focused on this like potential ecotourism business. So there's this potential misalignment that without a lot of work, it's kind of like when you got a climbing goal for the day and your climbing partners have other climbing goals for the day. And if you just like put a little bit of work in, you can make all those goals line up and achieve everything in a single day. And I think that's part of what the Climbing Initiative is doing, as well as like helping access those resources that, an organization in America or in France or Spain might have access to in terms of growing their community and their organization and having the impact they want to have, and making those resources available to people who might not be as easily able to access them.
Well, that's a great analogy. I love that. And I want to ask, a huge part of having you on and hearing your story and learning about the Climbing Initiative is introducing the Climbing Initiative to my audience. There's something like 10,000 people listening to this at this moment in time from all around the world. And, if people feel compelled by these stories, hearing about the Climbing Initiative, hearing about Climb Malawi, these other organizations maybe closer to home for them, I'm curious to hear what your vision is. Like, how can people that are listening help out? What do you guys need? Is it donation dollars? Is it just spreading awareness? Yeah, how can people learn more, get involved, those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think, we love people reaching out, but we are trying to build both Climb Malawi and the Climbing Initiative into organizations that can have full-time staff that actually are meeting the demand of all the potential impact that both organizations could be having. So donation dollars are certainly welcome. We're exploring a membership model at the Climbing Initiative that could be a way to kind of do recurring donations, spreading the word about us as well. We'd also love to hear about, if you're aware of community in another part of the world that you think we should connect with. We'd love to hear about that. But unique skills are always welcome, but we've been growing as sort of a volunteer organization and are now looking to kind of take it to the next level where our staff are working full time to meet the needs of the demands that we're getting from communities all over the world.
So cool, man. So exciting. And so fascinating to learn about this and have this conversation with you today. In wrapping up, I do want to ask you a little bit more about yourself. And I'm curious what your own climbing is looking like these days. What's next for you with your climbing, what you're excited about? I know you have 2 3-year-olds. Yeah. Do you get to climb anymore?
Yeah, I do. I climb all the time.
Nice.
I'm very grateful. Through a combination of help from my wife, who will take care of the kids while I'm gone, which is a big job when you're all on your own. But I think this season, most days, I think I've had more days at the crag when they're with me. I started bringing them to the crag.
And this is the Red.
Yeah, the Red River Gorge. Luckily, we didn't have, when on a recent family trip out to Denver, I did a bit of climbing without them and a bit of climbing with them. So I know that there are crags that are very easy to walk to when you've got some kids, but then there's some crags that are very difficult to walk to, especially when you're coming from a low elevation. Luckily here, the approaches aren't, they're usually a couple miles, so it's pretty manageable, even if you got kids on your shoulders. But it wasn't until last fall 2020, we moved back in the spring, but due to COVID, we didn't go climbing like outside. We didn't want to risk having to go to the hospital at a time when hospital resources were stretched really thin. So they were almost 2 when they started going to the crag and still in diapers. So I was taken to the crag through the transition of potty training, and now they're just starting to get into their harnesses and in their climbing shoes and up on the wall. They mostly just climb up like 8 feet or so and then go swinging with the rope. That's more their jam right now. But yeah, I've my climbing is in an interesting space, I think, because it's a combination of like, I'm trying to always get better. I work with Power Company Climbing for coaching.
Oh,
and,
cool.
Have been working with Laura at Warriors Way on mental coaching, because when it comes to sport climbing, I find mental performance a major limiting factor for me. So it's the project, if you will, hasn't been a route this season. It's actually been making rock climbing or sport climbing salubrious for me, making it life-giving, so that before it used to be like so draining that at the end of like a weekend, I'd like Monday morning at work, I'd be like mailing it in, like I was just like wiped out from the effort of really putting myself out there.
Like stress, fear, that sort of thing.
Yeah, just like, I think it's been interesting to learn and talk with a lot of people now as I develop more of a vocabulary and more of mental models for understanding the stress and just general emotional response that people have to a route or to different aspects of climbing. Climbing's really cool in that it like you can't hide anything from it. Like you have to show up with your full being. You have to use all of your physical capability. You have to use a lot of technique, and there's a huge mental component of it. Where even right now, I think I was getting pumped off of routes that were the same grade as ones that I was doing as a warm up the next day, and I think it was my hypothesis right now that I'm going to be testing is that it came down to like how comfortable I was on a certain size of grip at a certain angle. Not because I wasn't strong enough to hold it, but because I couldn't relax enough. And so I got pumped off from a stress response and not from an actual physical thing. So I've always bouldered a lot harder than my sport climbing would indicate. So yeah, it's been a really interesting journey of working with Laura, who's fantastic, to kind of better understand. It used to feel a little bit black box when it came to my sport climbing. I'd show up at a crag and it'd be a roll of the dice as to whether or not I was going to float up something or whether I was going to like just, punt off everything. And, now I'm at a place where I'm like much better able to climb and understand like if I got pumped off the wall, like why that happened. And if I floated, why that's happening. And, I'd much like historically would rather have thought the emotional component doesn't matter that much, but it's become the thing that does matter the most. And just kind of like Tonde was saying, when you interviewed him, when he's setting a route, he's trying to craft something that's going to create an emotional experience for somebody. That's kind of changed how I viewed going out on real rock. It's a rock climb is a sort of a playground in which we get to go. It's a stressful playground in which we get to have a different kind of experience and play different games. And that might be how many pull-ups can you do till the arms fall off, and it might be getting a little scared and seeing how you can manage that. And it's a really cool sport that we get to play with. So but yeah, my trouble is I love bouldering. I love trad climbing, trying to get better at that. Took a clinic, took Mary Eden's crack climbing clinic in Indian Creek in the spring with Laura incidentally and Kaya. There's just, you want to do all the things, and I got 3-year-olds. So it's like, I don't know when to boulder, when to go trad climbing, when to go sport climbing. And the 3-year-olds are in the background the whole time, but it's definitely a sport that I continue to get better at, and is continuing to bring new life energy and joy. So it's been great.
That's amazing to hear. And thanks for being so open and honest about that, because that's something that we probably don't open up enough about, we don't share enough about, because it's not the sexy training sending stuff, but it's so relatable for so many people listening. And awesome to hear how it's changing for you and growing for you. So
it's interesting to think about, like, who's doing the more impressive thing, the person who's like going up there and like screaming on tiny little edges and falling off and going like, wow, that was fun, versus the person who's like having a severe stress response and learning how to like manage that. Like that, like they're having the bigger epic to me.
Yeah.
That's they're really pushing themselves. Like that is hard.
Yeah.
Hard work.
They're having a death-defying experience up there.
Yeah. To give a quick example, I had for a while before I moved to Malawi, for a couple of years in a row, Canadian friends would come down and we'd have a big like week-long climbing trip. And on the last one, we had my main climbing partner, Scott Pagel, joined us. And he, this was like, for me as like an introvert and somebody who's like kind of feels energy scarce and for who sport climbing is really, and it was energy draining. It's getting better now. It's getting more life-giving. At the end of that trip, I was like exhausted. I was kind of in guide mode because, Scott and I were like the locals and we're trying to make sure everyone has a good time. I was also trying to send things before I moved. So I had this added pressure I was putting on myself to like get the projects done. And so, at the end of that trip on the last day, I couldn't do a route. I couldn't even get to the top of it. I was just like, I was near tears on the wall, just like drained and shattered emotionally. And my partner, Scott, I think he sent his hardest route. It wasn't the hardest grade, but it was realistically the hardest route, I think, on the last day of the trip, just because he managed to he gathered a crowd, they cheered him on. That was what he thrived on. And like, he found that extra 10% and he sent this route and he was like physically wrecked for, I think, a week. And like, wow. I hibernated for a day and like emotionally recharged and was like ready to go even harder, like after a single day, because what was like drained and shattered was not me physically. I wasn't climbing at my physical limit. I was climbing at my emotional limit. And it's been, really neat kind of exploring it. Like I said, building a vocabulary and some mental models to like understand what that's like, not just for me, but for other people and seeing them have that journey on the wall too. And when you have some language, you can actually talk about it, then it does become easier to actually have those conversations with the crag, and then people feel more comfortable talking about it. And there's some people who like find leading really stressful and have this pressure that because of the game, the artificial game we've made, these rules we've made, like it's not real unless you lead it. The top roping doesn't count, and it's a lot of nonsense. It's or they're just all games we're trying to play. So it's, but it's hard to. For example, I've known in my brain that. Grades are kind of meaningless for a long time, but it took going to Indian Creek to learn it in my heart. In Indian Creek, all the grades are ambiguous for people who don't know because it's, body shape dependent. So like
finger size dependent. Yeah.
Yeah. Like my perfect hand crack is not going to be the next person's perfect hand crack. And so there was 5/8 I didn't finish and there were 5/11s I cruised. And it's like, I was having a relationship with each route and I'm trying to maintain that without losing sight of it and getting lost in a debate about, is that 12C or is it 12A? Because, it doesn't matter. It's a unique opportunity to like face a challenge within yourself and like meet that challenge. And it's so easy to, I think grades are a game and they're a game within a game and they become a trap. And it's just really fun to kind of explore all this stuff, and working with a coach has been really helpful. Working with Laura to help also like put that all in perspective, as well as Chris Hampton at Power Company, keep it all in check and make it life-giving.
Well, that is so refreshing to hear all that. It's always been so fascinating to me, and I get lost in this all the time, just the amount of stress, whether it's performance anxiety or, real fear that we can put ourselves through when we're choosing to sign up for this arbitrary game. We're doing it theoretically because we love it, because it's so much fun, and then we just get lost in the weeds of expectation and performance and disappointment and the grade game within the game, all those sorts of things. So, really refreshing to hear how you're thinking about that. Thanks for sharing all that. That's really cool.
Yeah, happy to share. I could talk about this stuff all day long.
On that note, at the start of this conversation, you mentioned to me offline that there were that you'd been thinking about this conversation, and that there were three things that you felt were important for you to share. I just want to make sure that we touched on all of them in this conversation. Is there anything that we've left off that we haven't gotten to yet that you feel is important to talk about?
No, I think we've covered off pretty much everything. The three things were really that, I think, like you and like me, a lot of people probably come or have the perspective in the sport that like we once had, that the sport is, your gym and your local crags and the famous crags and some of the pros and comps. But there's, number two, the reality is that there's a lot of amazing communities out there in Uganda and El Salvador and Palestine and, Vietnam and all these amazing local climbing scenes that are doing really cool things, and not just really great climbing in amazing places, but also using climbing as a sport to actually make a significant difference. At the Climbing Initiative, we kind of have this theory of change. It looks like concentric circles, where we've all had the experience of the Climbing Initiative. Everyone who's involved feels passionately because they've had their lives changed by the sport. I think a lot of climbers have had that experience. And if you want to change a system, you need to change, all the pieces in the system. And those are the people, So we believe that through the sport of climbing, we can really actually change the world and create a better world, because it changes us as individuals, and then we go out and change our families and our communities, which changes our countries, and that happens both kind of within the sport of climbing, and I think spills over into the broader world. So kind of, our vision at the Climbing Initiative is a better world through climbing, and you can't change everything. I got a background in the water sector, and it's very entrenched. It's very slow moving. Climbing represents a way to find common ground with people. Like in Climb Malawi, you've got that, common passion that cuts across different socioeconomic differences and different cultures and different backgrounds, creates a common ground, and we can create these windows to a better world where like money and, power are less important, maybe not important, but, take more of a backseat to our passions for a little while or in a small space, that can give us hope of what the world could look like. And, thirdly, just that those amazing communities that we've been talking about all over the world doing amazing works, like they could be doing a lot more and growing a lot faster and having greater impact, with a small addition of resources, be that financial donations, be that kind of organizational, understanding of how to do impact assessments, how to do research, how to better promote their story. And so that's kind of what the Climbing Initiative is all about, is trying to help those organizations accelerate the impact that they're trying to have in the world.
Well, I love it. I love the vision. I've really enjoyed learning about all of this today and learning about you and your story. For people listening, I will link to all resources, Climb Malawi, the Climbing Initiative. I'll link to Tyler and those two other organizations on Instagram, as well as donation links, how you guys can learn more and help out if you feel called to do so. And I'll be sure to keep people posted when the best practices program is released and comes out. I'll be sure to point to that as well. I do like to wrap up every conversation that I have on the podcast with a note of gratitude. And I would just love to ask you, Tyler, what else has been really good? It's so cool to hear you talking about sport climbing and trying to find more joy and trying to make that more life-giving for yourself. What else has been really good in your life? What else has been filling you up these days? What else have you been appreciating lately?
That's easily my family. We've talked a lot about my kids, which are sources of joy and frustration as well, but not as much about my wife, who's, she works as a doctor, so she's working often 13-hour shifts, and she's working as a nocturnist at night. She's an OBGYN, so she's at the hospital at night delivering babies, and hopefully saving babies and saving moms, which has been extra tough during COVID. And yet still, she makes sure that we can get out to the crag, and that I get days of climbing in, and so she's been very supportive, and that's so appreciated, as well as just the challenges of working 13 hours in a stressful hospital environment, and then having trying to be the best mom she can be when she's home with the kids. And the kids are going to daycare and soon preschool a couple of days a week. But often those are happening on the days where she's asleep during the day because she works at night. So I get a couple hours, like when we're recording this, to actually hear my own thoughts and be able to concentrate on something for more than 2 minutes at a time. And she doesn't get those when she's not working and not sleeping. She's with me chasing the kids around. So she's working overtime, trying to do it all. And so I'm enormously grateful for her. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thanks for sharing that. Tyler, so good to have this conversation with you. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you again for sharing all of your stories, and for sharing so much that we can all learn from this conversation. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Once again, I'll link to everything that we talked about in the show notes for this episode at thenuggetclimbing.com. Appreciate all of you guys, and thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Shake it up, stop when the clock hits 13. Sing 1, 2, 3, 4. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it.